Imagine that an ordinary trip turns into a nightmare. John, a black taxi driver, is unfairly accused of assaulting a passenger who lies to get him arrested. What happens next will shock you. Watch to the end to find out how the truth comes to light and who will end up behind bars. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. What would you do in Dayan's place? It was a quiet evening in the city as Dayan navigated his taxi through the bustling streets, watching as the traffic lights flickered between red and green, guiding him through the night. His shift had been long, but nothing unusual. The usual passengers, the typical small talk, and the familiar sights of the city's late hours. For Dayan, driving was more than just a job. It was a space where he could zone out and think, letting the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the city ease his mind. As he approached an intersection, his radio crackled to life. "Pick up on West and 7th, the dispatcher's voice announced. "Got it," Dayan replied, adjusting his route toward the pickup location. West and 7th wasn't far, just a couple of blocks away. As he turned the corner, he saw her, a middle-aged woman, standing on the sidewalk, glancing at her phone with an impatient expression. She looked out of place, dressed in a designer coat and expensive heels, her face twisted in frustration. Dayan pulled up to the curb, unlocking the passenger door with a click. The woman didn't hesitate. She yanked the door open and slid into the back seat, slamming the door harder than necessary. Dayan glanced at her in the rearview mirror, taking in her tense body language and the way she crossed her arms over her chest, looking irritated already. "Good evening," Dayan greeted her, politely, though her demeanor was less than welcoming. "Drive," she snapped, not bothering to give him an address or even look up from her phone. Dayan's eyebrows lifted slightly at her tone, but he held back the urge to respond with anything more than professionalism. "Where to?" he asked, calmly, shifting the car into drive. "Take me to Oakwood, and hurry up," she barked, her voice dripping with impatience. Dayan nodded, pulling away from the curb. The streets were still busy, and he navigated through the usual city traffic, trying to remain as composed as possible. Despite the tension building in the back seat, he was no stranger to difficult passengers, people in a rush, stressed out, or simply rude. But there was something about her attitude that felt different. It wasn't just impatience, it was disdain, as if she believed he was beneath her. As they drove, the woman shifted in her seat, still glued to her phone. "Can't you go any faster?" she muttered, glancing up from her screen, for just a moment to scowl at the speedometer. "There's a lot of traffic," Dayan responded evenly, keeping his eyes on the road. "I'm going as fast as I can," she huffed, clearly unsatisfied. "Of course, typical." Dayan frowned at the comment, but said nothing. He had heard worse, but the way she spat the word typical sent a chill down his spine. He focused on driving, hoping the ride would be over soon. But the tension in the car only seemed to grow. A few minutes passed in silence before the woman spoke again, this time her voice lower, more venomous. "Do you even know what you're doing? You probably don't even live around here." Dayan's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he still didn't respond. He had been in this situation before. The insinuations, the passive-aggressive remarks. He knew what they really meant. It was easier to ignore them, to get through the ride without reacting. But this time, the atmosphere felt heavier, more personal. The woman continued to mutter under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear. "This is what happens when you let anyone drive these days. No standards, no class." Dayan clenched his teeth, his patience wearing thin, but he reminded himself to stay calm. Just get her to her destination, and it would be over. He had learned long ago not to engage with passengers like this. It never ended well, however. It seemed the woman wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him through the rearview mirror. "What's your name, anyway? Don't think I didn't notice how you were looking at me earlier." Dayan's heart rate picked up slightly, but he kept his voice steady. "I wasn't looking at you, ma'am. Just driving." "Sure," she said sarcastically, leaning back in her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Men like you always think they can get away with things. Men like you." The words echoed in Dayan's mind, the meaning behind them clear. He had heard it before, too many times to count, but the way she said it, with such venom, made his skin crawl. Dayan focused on the road, trying to push down the frustration building inside him. The drive seemed to stretch out longer than it should have, every minute dragging by. The woman's insults continued, muttered under her breath, but loud enough for him to hear. Each one landed like a blow, chipping away at his patience. Finally, they reached Oakwood, and Dan pulled up to the curb. "Here we are," he said, relieved that the ride was finally over. But the woman didn't get out. Instead, she sat there, staring at him with cold, calculating eyes. "I should report you," she offered suddenly. Dan blinked, taken aback. "Report me? For what?" "You know exactly what for," she snapped, her voice rising. "You've been staring at me this whole ride, making me uncomfortable. You're disgusting." Dan's eyes widened in shock. "I didn't." "You think I didn't notice?" she continued, her voice now loud and sharp, drawing the attention of people walking by. "You've been eyeing me the whole time, making comments, driving recklessly. You're lucky I don't call the police right now." Dan was speechless. He had done nothing of the sort, and the accusation felt like a slap in the face. His mind raced, trying to figure out how the situation had escalated so quickly. "Ma'am, I assure you." "Shut up," she yelled, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police. You're not getting away with this." Dayan's heart sank as he watched her dial the number, her fingers flying across the screen. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something far more dangerous. He knew what could happen if the police got involved. He knew the stakes. The woman stepped out of the car, still yelling into the phone, her voice shrill and filled with fake panic. "Yes, officer. I need help. My driver just attacked me. He was aggressive, and I'm scared for my safety. Please hurry." Dayan's blood ran cold as he heard her words. She was lying, and he had no way to prove it. He watched as she paced on the sidewalk, her voice growing louder with each passing second. People were starting to stare, their eyes filled with curiosity, but no one moved to intervene. Within minutes, the flashing lights of a police car appeared at the end of the street, and Dayan's heart sank. This was it. This was how it always started. The woman turned toward him, a cruel smile spreading across her face as she saw the approaching officers. "You're done," she hissed. The flashing lights of the police cruiser bounced off the buildings, growing brighter as the car neared. Dayan's pulse quickened, his mind racing through everything that had just happened. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white, trying to steady his breath. He hadn't done anything wrong. He knew that, but the way the woman had framed the situation, the fear she had feigned in her voice, was dangerous. The police car pulled to a stop right behind his taxi, and two officers stepped out, their faces stern, their posture alert. The woman, still standing on the sidewalk, waved them over frantically, her voice cutting through the night. "That's him," she shouted, pointing a finger at Dan. "He tried to attack me. He's dangerous." Dan's heart dropped. He wanted to protest, to shout that it wasn't true, but he knew better than to move too quickly. One wrong gesture could make things worse. He could feel the weight of the moment, how easily things could spiral out of control. The two officers, both white, exchanged a glance before one of them walked toward Dayan's car. The other stayed with the woman, listening to her frantic account of what had supposedly happened. She was gesturing wildly, her voice growing shriller by the second, as if she were replaying some traumatic event. Dayan sat still, his hands on the wheel, his mind trying to figure out what to do. He had seen enough situations like this in the news to know that he needed to stay calm, to keep his movements slow and deliberate. But his heart was pounding in his chest, each beat echoing louder in his ears. The first officer approached the driver's side window, tapping on the glass with the end of his flashlight. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice flat, emotionless. Dayan rolled down the window slightly. "Officer, I didn't do anything," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "She's lying. I never touched her." "Step out of the car," the officer repeated, this time with more force. Dayan hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached for the door handle. He opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands where the officer could see them. His heart raced as the officer eyed him, his gaze sharp and suspicious. The second officer, still standing with the woman, called out, "She says he was aggressive, tried to grab her. She's scared for her life." "That's not true," Dayan said, his voice rising slightly in desperation. "I didn't touch her. She's making it up." The officer, closest to him, took a step forward, narrowing the gap between them. "We'll sort it out," he said, though his tone didn't offer much hope. "But right now, we need you to cooperate." "I am cooperating," Dayan replied, his hands still raised slightly. "I've done nothing wrong." Without warning, the officer grabbed Dayan's arm, twisting it behind his back with a force that made him wince in pain. "Don't resist," the officer snapped. "I'm not resisting," Dayan exclaimed, but his words fell on deaf ears. The second officer joined them now, his presence adding more weight to the situation. Together, the two officers forced Dayan toward the hood of his own taxi, pushing him face down against the cold metal. His chest hit the hood hard, knocking the breath out of him for a second, and he felt the sharp sting of handcuffs being tightened around his wrists. His mind was spinning. How had this escalated so quickly? He had done everything right, kept calm, followed their instructions, but none of that seemed to matter. His body was pressed hard against the car, the weight of the officers holding him down, and all he could think about was the injustice of it all. The woman's false accusations, the police's immediate willingness to believe her. None of it made sense, and yet, here he was, treated like a criminal. "Please listen," Dayan tried again, his voice strained against the pressure of the officer's knee on his back. "I didn't do anything. She's lying." The officers didn't respond. One of them patted him down, searching his pockets for anything that could further incriminate him, while the other kept him pinned to the car. From the sidewalk, the woman watched, her face a mixture of triumph and satisfaction. She had gotten exactly what she wanted, and the look in her eyes made it clear that she was enjoying every second of it. "That's him," she called out again, her voice dripping with false fear. "He's dangerous. I thought he was going to kill me." Dayan's blood boiled at her words, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would make a difference now. He was at their mercy, and the truth didn't seem to matter. The second officer finally spoke, his voice firm and authoritative. "You're under arrest for assault and harassment. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words hit Dayan like a punch to the gut. Assault? Harassment? He hadn't done anything. His mind raced as the officer recited his rights, and he struggled to comprehend the nightmare unfolding around him. The first officer yanked him up from the car, his arms still twisted painfully behind his back. Dayan's legs wobbled for a moment before they steadied under him, but the humiliation of the scene burned into his mind. The crowd that had gathered around the commotion stared with wide eyes, some with curiosity, others with indifference. No one stepped forward to help. No one questioned what was happening. The woman's voice cut through the noise again. "Thank you, officers," she said, her tone suddenly sweet and relieved, as if she had just been rescued from some terrible danger. "I didn't know what he was capable of." Dayan gritted his teeth. The words lodged in his throat. He wanted to scream, to tell everyone watching that it was all a lie, but he knew it wouldn't matter. He had seen this play out too many times before. The truth didn't stand a chance when prejudice had already made up its mind. The officers pushed him toward the police cruiser, opening the back door and shoving him inside. The hard plastic seat was cold against his back, and the door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through his bones. He was trapped, not just physically, but by the weight of a system that had already condemned him. Through the window, he watched as the woman gave a statement to the officers, her hands moving animatedly as she described her fabricated version of events. Every gesture, every word was a lie, but no one questioned her story. Why would they? She was the victim, and Dayan in their eyes was the threat. As the police cruiser pulled away from the curb, Dayan leaned his head back against the seat, his mind spinning. He had done nothing wrong, but that didn't seem to matter now. He was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, guilty until proven innocent. The city lights blurred past the window as they drove toward the police station, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. He had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Dayan sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded in his lap, eyes focused on the judge. The courtroom was eerily quiet, the low hum of murmured conversations filling the air as people took their seats. The weight of the last few days had drained him, but he had no choice but to keep pushing forward. This was it, the trial. Everything rested on what would happen here. his entire future. He glanced over at his attorney, Lisa Mathers, a skilled lawyer with a reputation for fighting tough cases. She had been supportive since day one, understanding the gravity of the situation and recognizing how deeply the scales of justice were already tipped against him. But even with her experience, Dayan knew the odds were stacked. The prosecutor, a cold-eyed man named Henderson, stood confidently at his table, ready to present the case against Dayan. His demeanor was calm, almost smug, as if the outcome were already decided. Henderson didn't need much to build his argument, just the word of one white woman and 2 police officers. That was enough. As the judge called the court to order, Dayan felt his pulse quicken. The tension in the room was palpable. Every move, every word mattered now. The trial was starting, and the walls were closing in. "Prosecution, you may proceed with your opening statement," the judge said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. Henderson stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he stepped forward. He looked directly at the jury, his eyes cool and calculating. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "you are here today to deliver justice. The facts of this case are clear and undeniable. The defendant, Dayan Phillips, a taxi driver, used his position of power to intimidate and assault an innocent woman, leaving her shaken and terrified. Dayan's chest tightened at the accusation. It was all wrong, a twisted version of events that had never happened. But as Henderson continued, his words painted a vivid picture for the jury, a picture where Dayan was the aggressor, the villain, and his passenger the helpless victim. Henderson paced slowly, letting each word sink in. The victim, a woman alone at night, trusted this man to get her safely to her destination. Instead, she was subjected to fear, harassment, and intimidation. She did nothing to provoke him, yet he became hostile, making her fear for her life. When the police arrived, she was in such a state of distress that they had no choice but to intervene immediately. This man's actions were not only reckless, they were dangerous. Dayan could feel the eyes of the jury on him, judging him, weighing the prosecutor's words. He wanted to shout, to stand up and say it was all a lie, but he knew better. This was a game of perception now, and in that moment, perception was all that mattered. Henderson turned to face the jury again. "You will hear testimony from the victim herself. You will hear from the officers who arrived on the scene. They will tell you exactly what they witnessed. A man out of control, who posed a threat to a woman who was simply trying to get home." He paused for effect, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the room. "We ask that you consider the evidence carefully and deliver a verdict that upholds the safety and security of our community. This man must be held accountable for his actions." With that, Henderson returned to his seat, confident that he had laid the groundwork for his case. The jury shifted slightly, their faces unreadable, but Dayan could feel the doubt creeping in. Henderson had done his job. He had framed the narrative in a way that made Dayan look guilty before the evidence had even been presented. Lita stood next, straightening her jacket as she prepared to give her opening statement. She glanced at Dayan briefly, offering him a reassuring nod before addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Lisa began, "what you have just heard is a carefully crafted story, one designed to provoke an emotional reaction. But I urge you to look beyond the emotion and focus on the facts. My client, Mr. Phillips, is not a violent man. He did not assault or intimidate anyone. What you will hear in this trial are the words of a woman who made false accusations, and you will see how those accusations were taken at face value without any real investigation." She paused, making eye contact with the jurors. "The evidence will show that there were no threats, no violence, and no harassment. This case is built entirely on the testimony of one person, a person who had every reason to lie. You will also hear from witnesses who saw the police's actions that night, actions that were unjustified and excessive." Lisa's voice was steady, controlled. She wasn't trying to stir emotions like Henderson had. Instead, she was laying the foundation for a logical, fact-based argument. "My client was treated unfairly from the moment the police arrived. He was not given a chance to explain, not treated with the presumption of innocence. The officers, despite having no evidence of a crime, chose to believe the worst. They arrested him, brutally, without cause. We will prove that the actions taken against him were based on bias and not on fact." As she finished her statement, Lisa returned to her seat, and Dayan felt a small flicker of hope. She had done well, but he knew the battle was just beginning. The prosecution had the advantage, and they would use everything at their disposal to push their narrative. The trial moved forward, and Dayan listened as the prosecution called their first witness, the woman who had accused him. She took the stand, her face pale and drawn, her hands shaking slightly as she recounted her version of events. "I was just trying to get home," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't say anything to provoke him. He just started getting angry for no reason. He was driving recklessly, and when I asked him to slow down, he got even more aggressive. I was scared. I thought he was going to hurt me." The jury watched her intently, their eyes filled with concern. Dayan's stomach turned as he listened to the lies spill from her lips. She made it sound so convincing, so real, but he knew the truth. None of it had happened the way she described. She continued, her voice breaking slightly for effect. "When I called the police, I didn't know what else to do. I just wanted to be safe." Henderson stood up again, his voice soft but firm. "And when the police arrived, did they seem concerned for your safety?" The woman nodded quickly. "Yes. They saw how scared I was. They knew right away that something was wrong." "Thank you," Henderson said, returning to his seat with a satisfied look on his face. Dayan's attorney, Lisa, stood to cross-examine, but the damage had been done. The woman's performance was flawless, designed to tug at the heartstrings of the jury, and it had worked. Dayan could see it in their faces. They were already leaning toward a guilty verdict. The rest of the prosecution's case followed in a similar pattern. The officers who had arrested Dayan took the stand, their testimony carefully aligned with the woman's story. They described his so-called aggression, his resistance, and how they had no choice but to subdue him for the safety of everyone involved. With each word, Dayan felt the walls closing in. It didn't matter that none of it was true. It didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. In the eyes of the law, he was guilty until proven innocent, and the prosecution had made sure that proving his innocence would be nearly impossible. By the time the prosecution rested, Dayan felt like he was drowning. The evidence, or lack thereof, wasn't in his favor. The jury had been fed a steady diet of lies, and the truth seemed like a distant memory. As the judge called a recess, Dayan leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. He had known this would be hard, but he hadn't expected to feel so helpless. The case was slipping away from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. "We still have a chance, Dayan. We're not done yet." But even as she said the words, Dayan could see the doubt in her eyes. The weight of the prosecution's case had been overwhelming, and now they were running out of time. As the court reconvened after the recess, Dayan's anxiety hung in the air like a thick cloud. The weight of the prosecution's case had felt suffocating, and it was hard to imagine how things could turn around. He could feel the eyes of the jury on him, their expressions unreadable, but he sensed the doubt in the room. The prosecutor's relentless portrayal of him as a threat had left its mark, and Dayan was beginning to fear that no matter what he or his attorney did, the verdict had already been decided. Lisa, his attorney, had kept her composure throughout the trial, but now even she seemed a little tense. They had their defense ready, but they both knew that without solid evidence or testimony that directly challenged the prosecution's narrative, things would only get worse. "Defense, you may proceed with your witnesses." The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, signaling the moment they had been waiting for. Lisa stood and adjusted her blazer before turning to Dayan. "We've got this," she whispered, though Dayan could hear the effort in her voice to maintain her confidence. The first few defense witnesses provided little in terms of a breakthrough. They were character witnesses, friends, and colleagues of Dayan who vouched for his professionalism and peaceful nature, but their testimonies couldn't directly counter the vivid account the prosecution had painted of that night. The courtroom felt stagnant. Even as each witness took the stand, the jury seemed unmoved. Henderson sat across from them, watching everything unfold with that same smug confidence, as though he knew their efforts were futile. Lisa called the next witness, another passenger who had ridden in Dayan's taxi several times before. She testified that Dayan had always been courteous and calm, that he never raised his voice or acted aggressively. But again, it was character testimony. Nothing that could refute the lies told by the woman or the police officers. Dayan's heart sank further with each passing minute. It felt like the trial was slipping through his fingers, like they were losing the battle before it had even truly begun. And then, just when hope seemed lost, a new figure entered the courtroom. The door at the back of the room creaked open, and a man, unassuming in his appearance, quietly slipped in. He was dressed casually, blending in with the crowd, but there was something about him that immediately drew Lisa's attention. She had been scanning the room, perhaps looking for a miracle, and it seemed like this stranger was it. The man, catching Lisa's eye, nodded slightly, as if he knew exactly why he was there. Lisa turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call a last-minute witness." Henderson immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense didn't submit this witness in pretrial proceedings." The judge, an older man with a stern but fair demeanor, looked over the rim of his glasses at Lisa. "Miss Mathers, do you have an explanation for this?" "I do, Your Honor," Lisa said firmly. "This witness only came forward today. He has crucial information that directly contradicts the prosecution's case. We ask the court's understanding in allowing him to testify." The judge hesitated for a moment, considering the weight of the request, then nodded. "I'll allow it, but this had better be worth the court's time, Miss Mathers." Lisa nodded in return and turned to the man. "Please state your name for the record," she said as he approached the stand. "My name is Jake Harper," the man said, his voice steady but soft. "And what brings you to this courtroom today, Mr. Harper?" Lisa asked, her tone filled with purpose. "I was there," Jake replied simply, his words causing a ripple of murmurs to pass through the courtroom. "I saw what happened that night." Dayan's heart leapt. Could this really be happening? Could someone have actually witnessed the truth? He sat up straighter, his pulse quickening as Jake prepared to give his testimony. Lisa nodded, her eyes gleaming with hope. "Please tell the court what you saw." Jake cleared his throat, glancing briefly at the jury before continuing. "I was walking my dog that night. I saw the police car pull up, and I saw the woman standing on the sidewalk. I didn't know what was going on at first, but I started paying attention when I saw the officers approach the taxi." He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The courtroom was completely silent now, everyone hanging on his every word. "I saw the officers pull Mr. Phillips out of the car. They were rough with him, and he didn't resist. He kept saying he didn't do anything, but they wouldn't listen. They pushed him onto the hood of the car and cuffed him. I recorded part of it on my phone." At the mention of the recording, Lisa's face brightened. "You have a recording of the arrest?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled to hide her excitement. Jake nodded. "Yes, I couldn't get everything, but I got enough to show that Mr. Phillips wasn't resisting and that the woman's story didn't match what I saw." Henderson quickly rose to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly unusual. The defense is introducing new evidence at the last minute without proper vetting." The judge raised his hand to silence him. "Overruled. The defense may proceed." Lisa smiled inwardly as she stepped closer to the witness stand. "Mr. Harper, is there any doubt in your mind about what you witnessed that night?" "None," Jake replied confidently. "I saw everything clearly. The police didn't have any reason to treat Mr. Phillips the way they did." "And you're willing to submit the recording to the court as evidence?" Lisa asked. "I am," Jake said, pulling out his phone and handing it to Lisa. As the video was queued up and projected for the jury to see, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The recording wasn't long, but it was enough to show that Dayan had been compliant, that the police had been unnecessarily rough with him, and that the woman's account didn't match what had happened. The video showed the officers pulling Dayan out of the car and slamming him against the hood without hesitation. His voice could be heard, calm but confused, as he tried to explain that he hadn't done anything wrong, but his words were drowned out by the officers' aggressive commands and the woman's exaggerated cries for help. The jury watched intently, their expressions shifting as the truth began to unravel before them. The recording was a stark contrast to the narrative the prosecution had been pushing for the entire trial. When the video ended, Lisa turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the truth, not the lies that have been told to you, but the reality of what happened that night. Mr. Phillips was treated unfairly, and this recording proves it." Henderson, visibly shaken by the turn of events, tried to salvage his case. He stood to cross-examine Jake, but his questions were weak, desperate. The damage had been done. As the court recessed for the day, Dayan finally felt a glimmer of hope. Jake Harper's testimony had been the break they needed. The jury now had something real to consider, something that cast doubt on the prosecution's entire case. Lisa placed a hand on Dayan's shoulder as they stood to leave the courtroom. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "But this was a good day, a really good day." Dayan nodded, the weight on his chest beginning to lift, if only slightly. The truth had finally come to light, and for the first time since the nightmare began, he allowed himself to hope that justice might actually prevail. The atmosphere in the courtroom the next morning was electric, charged with anticipation as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The bombshell revelation of Jake Harper's testimony had shifted the trial's momentum, casting serious doubt on the prosecution's case. Dayan could feel the difference in the room. The tension was still there, but now it was mixed with a flicker of possibility. For the first time since this nightmare began, he had hoped that the truth might win out. He sat at the defense table next to Lisa, who was preparing her final arguments. Henderson, the prosecutor, looked less confident today, his composure rattled by the unexpected twist of the previous day. Dayan could tell that Henderson was scrambling to salvage his case, but the damage had been done. The jury had seen the truth, the video of his arrest, the lies from the woman who had accused him, and now it was time for them to decide his fate. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone stood as he took his seat. The air was heavy with expectation as the judge addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are nearing the conclusion of this trial. You have heard the evidence, and soon you will be asked to deliberate and render a verdict. But first, we will hear the closing arguments from both sides." Henderson stood first, adjusting his tie as he stepped forward to address the jury. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a grim determination. He knew his case was crumbling, but he still had to give it his best shot. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Henderson began, his voice tight, "this case is about more than just the actions of one night. It's about the safety of our community and the trust we place in the people who serve us. Yes, we saw a video yesterday that casts doubt on some of the events, but that doesn't change the fact that a woman felt threatened, that she believed she was in danger." He paused, trying to gauge the jury's reaction. "What matters here is not just what you saw on that video, but how the victim felt. Fear is real, and it is powerful. The actions of the police were based on that fear, and their job is to protect people in distress. Mr. Phillips may not have acted aggressively in the video, but that doesn't mean the victim didn't feel threatened by him." Dayan clenched his fists under the table, the frustration building in his chest. He had expected Henderson to play this card, to pivot away from the facts and try to focus on feelings. It was a weak argument, but one that could still sway the jury if they let emotion cloud their judgment. Henderson continued, his voice rising slightly. "We ask you to consider the bigger picture. The victim was a woman alone at night, and she had every reason to be afraid. The police did their job by acting swiftly to protect her. That is what matters here." With that, Henderson returned to his seat, his face grim. He had played his final card, and now it was up to the jury to decide if they would buy it. Lita stood next, her face calm and composed, as she walked toward the jury. Dayan could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to let this slip through her fingers. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Lisa began, her voice steady and clear. "You've heard a lot in this trial about fear, about perceptions, about feelings. But what we're here to determine is not based on feelings. It's based on facts, and the facts of this case are clear. Mr. Phillips did not threaten anyone. He did not harm anyone. He did not act aggressively, and he certainly did not deserve to be treated the way he was by the police." She paused, letting her words sink in. The jury's eyes were fixed on her, listening intently. "You saw the video with your own eyes," Lisa continued. "You saw how Mr. Phillips was treated. He was calm, he was compliant, and yet the police escalated to the situation unnecessarily. They acted on assumptions, not facts. And worse, they acted on the false accusations of a woman who lied to them from the very beginning." Lisa turned slightly, gesturing toward Dayan. "Mr. Phillips is not the villain in this story. He is the victim of lies, of prejudice, of a system that too often assumes the worst. based on nothing more than skin color. The jury shifted in their seats, some of them nodding slightly in agreement. Lisa had hit the heart of the matter, and Dan could feel the tide turning in his favor. "This case is about justice," Lisa said, her voice strong and clear. "It's about holding people accountable for their actions, no matter who they are. The woman who accused Mr. Phillips lied, and the police failed to investigate those lies before taking extreme action. Now, it's up to you to set things right." Lisa took a deep breath before delivering her final words. "We ask you to find Mr. Phillips not guilty of all charges, and we ask that justice be served, not just for him, but for everyone who has ever been falsely accused and unfairly treated by a system that should protect them." With that, Lisa returned to her seat, her closing argument delivered with precision and conviction. Dan felt a surge of hope as the judge instructed the jury to retire to deliberate. The courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of what was to come hanging in the air like a storm cloud. For Dan, the hours that followed felt like an eternity. Every minute stretched on, his thoughts racing with possibilities, both good and bad. He had come so far, but it was all out of his hands now. The jury had to make their decision, and he could only wait. After what felt like an eternity, the courtroom was called back into session. The jury had reached a verdict. Dan's heart pounded as he took his seat once more, his breath shallow as the foreman of the jury stood to deliver the decision. The judge addressed the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, his voice steady but serious. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The foreman unfolded a piece of paper and cleared his throat. "In the case of the People versus Dan Phillips, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges." A wave of relief crashed over Dan, his body going limp with the release of tension. He had won. The truth had prevailed. He could barely process what was happening as Lisa squeezed his shoulder, her face lighting up with a smile. But the courtroom wasn't done yet. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Henderson, based on the evidence presented in this trial, there is cause for concern regarding the actions of the arresting officers and the veracity of the accuser's statements. I am ordering an investigation into the conduct of both the officers and the accuser." Dan's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. It was more than just his exoneration. Justice was coming for those who had wronged him. Days later, it was announced that the police officers who had brutally arrested Dan without cause were being charged with misconduct and assault. The woman who had falsely accused him faced charges of perjury and was slapped with a massive fine for her false accusations and racial bias. As Dan stood outside the courthouse, finally a free man, the weight of the past few weeks lifted from his shoulders, Lisa stood beside him, sharing a quiet moment of victory. The truth had come to light, and the system, for once, had worked in his favor. "I don't even know how to thank you," Dan said, his voice filled with gratitude. Lisa smiled. "You don't have to. Justice did what it was supposed to do today." Dan nodded, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been wronged by a system that too often failed to see them as human. His story was just one of many, but today it had ended with justice, and for that he was grateful. Thank you for watching until the end. This story is a powerful reminder of the fight for justice and the importance of standing up for what's right. If you found this video impactful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Dan's situation? Also, check out the other videos on the channel for more stories that challenge injustice and inspire change. Your support means everything, so stay tuned for more.